All right, this video is going to go through, it's going to pick up where we left off with the Cold War, 1953. We did talk about like the Sputnik, which was 1957, but really at the end of the Korean War, well Stalin's going to die. All right, what a world, what a world. It's the Wicked Witch of I guess he'd be of the East, not the West, though, because he's East. Doesn't really apply. But anyway, so Stalin's going to die, and finally the Cold War is going to be over. Not so fast, my friend. Some of you guys are probably like, who is this guy? And if you don't watch college football, you won't know. It still doesn't really make sense, but that's all right. I enter Nikita Khrushchev. With the death of Stalin in 1953, Khrushchev emerged as the new Soviet leader. He is going to actually not be technically the fully considered the sole premier of the Soviet Union for a few more years, but he is going to assume control. He's going to institute a de-Stalinization policy in the Soviet Union, which is going to free Gulag prisoners. That's those prison camps in Siberia. He's going to lessen some of the extreme policies. He desires peaceful coexistence with the United States. So some of this, the U.S. is like, man, this is awesome. Let's go. All right, so they're jacked. But like many things in life, if it seems too good to be true, it probably is. All right, and so he did do some good things. Like I said, he visited the West. He wanted to have good relationship. He reduced some of these harsh policies. He relaxed censorship. So some of the stuff is good. All right, but he also did some other things, like he sent he brought the hammer down on his own satellite nations because they sensed that there was a weakness within the Soviet Union, so they started to rebel, and he just rolled in a bunch of tanks and just hammered it. Killed thousands of people. The USSR also shut down an American spy plane, took the pilot prisoner. You might say that's not really his fault. We were flying in their territory, which is fair. But that still just created conflict and tension between the two sides. Launched the Sputnik, created ICBMs, intercontinental ballistic missiles, helped construct the Berlin Wall, and did a little thing called the Cuban Missile Crisis. That's going to be pretty much where we get as close as possible to an all-out nuclear war. All right, so he did some good things, and then there's some crazy stuff that happened. All right, so to talk about the Berlin Wall. All right, the Berlin Wall is going to get constructed in 1961. All right, just to recap, the U.S. has territory in this whole area is the Soviet zone, and the U.S. has territory in West Berlin. We already talked about the Berlin blockade where they couldn't get supplies, so they had to fly them in. Well, there's going to be another situation that occurs in Berlin. It's called the Berlin Wall. All right, so the U.S. has territory in West Berlin. All right, Berlin is deep within the Soviet zone, and the Soviets severely mistreated the Germans, and they had for a while. They forced a lot of Germans, any scientists, construction workers, etc. They took them out of Germany, out of their zone, and forced them to go to the Soviet Union to rebuild the Soviet Union after the Germans had obviously destroyed it. And so they had not really treated the Germans all that well, and not to mention East Germany and East Berlin, it was pretty poverty stricken. All right, the communist dictatorship, they had restricted freedoms. The economy it was struggling pretty mightily. And so these East Germans, they had a choice. So it says, should I stay as a communist dictatorship with restricted freedoms, or should I flee to West Berlin with more freedoms, equality, rights? They had a thriving economy. Everything was going really, really well. And it was, man, it's like, man, what should I do? This is tough. I stay where I don't have rights and live in poverty, or should I flee to a place that has a booming economy, jobs, freedom, equality? I have rights. I can say what I want. It's not a tough call. Obviously, people were piecing up. All right, they're like, we out. All right, and so the Berlin Wall is going to be constructed. So now this gets confusing because it's different. All right, so it's different than the Berlin blockade. The blockade was meant to get the Allies out. This was really helped to keep people from entering West Berlin and fleeing East Germany. Because remember, all of East Germany, all of West Berlin is surrounded by Soviet zone. So it's not just East Berlin. It's the whole thing is surrounded. So they put a huge wall around the whole thing. All right, because they had 3 million people. We said it was a city of 2.5 million people in West Berlin. They had 3 million people after the blockade leave. Doctors, engineers, teachers just flee. They go from West Berlin to from East Berlin or East Germany to West Berlin to live. And so Khrushchev helped construct the Berlin Wall. Unlike the Iron Curtain, and this is where it also gets confusing because it's like, yeah, Berlin Wall, Berlin Blockade. This wall was meant to keep people from fleeing, even though they said it was meant to keep the fascists out. Really, it was to keep people from fleeing. And then in the Iron Curtain was a metaphorical. It didn't actually exist, but it was just a term to describe the divided Europe. This actually was a physical barrier that is going to grow to represent the hostility between these two sides. So it was created to keep the people of East Germany and East Berlin from fleeing to the more prosperous West Berlin. All right, and it was much more than just a fence. All right, it had barbed wire, it had watchtowers, it had dogs, it had all sorts of stuff, which we'll talk about here in a second. It really became known as a symbol for the hatred between the two sides of democracy and communism. That they put a wall up. They hate each other so much they put a wall up. Like I said, there's minefields. There's like 55,000 mines placed throughout. Ditches. So you got East Germany or East Berlin on one side, West Berlin on the other side. You got this pit. This is the death zone in between, or the death strip in between, and roughly 150, 200 people died crossing it. A lot of people did make it still, but it was a much more difficult task to hop the fence, make it through this death strip, and then hop the fence again to get to West Berlin. All right, it was about 10 feet tall. Khrushchev, most notorious for the Cuban Missile Crisis, but in order to understand that, we first got to talk about the Bay of Pigs. All right, so a guy by the name of Fidel Castro is going to come into power. He's going to lead an uprising against a very friendly U.S. regime that is in place in the 1950s. They were very pro-U.S. They were pro-U.S. business, very friendly to the United States. And that's good because you got Cuba, which is just 90 miles off the coast of Florida. Well, now all of a sudden you've got Fidel Castro, who's led an uprising. Now they have a communist dictatorship in their backyard. Kennedy is not going to like that. Newly elected president John F. Kennedy doesn't like having a communist in his backyard. And so Kennedy is going to approve a mission that is going to land a bunch of exiled Cuban fighters at an area known as the Bay of Pigs. All right, and so they're going to equip them. They've trained them. They've given them resources. The CIA dressed up a Cuban plane and they bombed. They tried to bomb the Cuban Air Force and then land these guys. They're going to create an uprising, recruit more people, and they're going to overthrow Castro. So that's the plan. Why use Cuban exile fighters? Once again, the U.S. is trying to make this, so they painted a Cuban insignia on their planes. They're trying to make it seem like hey, we're clandestine. We don't have anything to do with this. This is all just an internal uprising. If you got a bunch of dead U.S. soldiers in Cuba, that's a problem for the world. Now, this is not going to be a very good secret. Everybody's going to know it was the U.S. that led it. All right, so the invasion began on Sunday, April 16th. Let's go. All right, and so the invasion begins. They drop these troops get let off. They're in these boats, and within 24 hours, they begin to surrender. That didn't work. That wasn't great, U.S. And so the situation in Cuba was not good. The primary source from that time, it said the Cuban forces were stronger. They had much more forces than we thought. The popular response to get people to join their cause was much weaker, and the tactical position, the strategic position, was much worse than what they thought. So when you're mad at the U.S., who do you call? Answer, you call the Soviet Union. All right, and they had already established, so once Castro took over, they had already removed some of those pro-U.S. policies, which is why the U.S. wanted that guy out of there. But now he's going to establish a relationship with the Soviet Union even more so. And in 1962, Khrushchev began to place intermediate nuclear missiles in Cuba. These missiles were meant to counteract missiles that the U.S. had in Turkey that could attack many of the key areas in the Soviet Union, and it would strengthen the Soviets' nuclear capability. The U.S. discovered the construction of these missiles by a chance flyer over a U-2 spy plane, and this is really going to become known as the height of the Cold War, where the two countries, if one country makes a mistake, it's going to lead to an all-out nuclear war. All right, and so the U.S. found out that these missiles were operational 2 weeks prior before they were operational. So they found out they were there, 2 weeks before they were operational. And so once operational, they had to get these missiles dealt with. So they had 2 weeks to figure this out, because if they didn't, if these missiles became operational and a war broke out, 80 million Americans could have been killed within 10 minutes if the Soviets desired. I mean, it could have happened very quickly. So what are they going to do? Should they invade Cuba? Should they bomb Cuba? Should they have a preemptive strike at the Soviet Union? Should they set up a blockade of Cuba? Now, these are all very real scenarios that were laid out. These were all options that Kennedy had. He had a lot of pressure to do these things. I want you guys to go ahead and write in what you think he should do. All right. Well, Kennedy is going to decide to set up a blockade of Cuba, not allowing any more ships, not allowing any more of the warheads to get in to Cuba. And then the Soviet ships show up and they threaten to run the blockade. They realize that more missiles, these missiles are on the way, these nuclear warheads are on the way. More of them to finish the construction. The Soviet ships threatened to run the blockade, which would have led to military intervention. Fortunately, cooler heads prevailed. The U.S. and the Soviet Union, they had a secret deal that was struck that allowed for them to say, hey, we will take out, the Soviet Union says, we will take out our missiles in Cuba if the U.S. 6 months later agrees to remove the missiles in Turkey. And now the U.S. is going to, this isn't going to come out till much later, because they don't want to seem like they got bullied into taking missiles out. Basically every time the Soviets want something, they'll just try to set up missiles in Cuba again. So they're like, if this gets out, we're just going to keep them in Turkey. We can't look like we got bullied. But at the end, a nuclear holocaust was averted. And both sides, they had said if they would have invaded Cuba, they would have launched a nuclear missile. They would have attacked the United States. If they would have bombed Cuba, they would have attacked the United States. If the missiles would have became operational, the U.S. would have bombed Cuba and potentially launched a preemptive strike on the Soviet Union. All right, and so it was so close to these two sides going to an all-out nuclear war, but luckily that got averted.